The iron door groaned open, its echo swallowing into the stone depths of the White Tower. February frost clung to the walls like ancient prayers, and somewhere in the darkness below, water dripped with the patience of centuries. The torchlight flickered against wet stone as the guards descended, their footsteps marking time like a funeral bell. In the chamber, shadows danced across instruments that had no names in polite company. The air hung thick with the scent of fear and old blood, mingling with the dampness that seeped from the Thames just beyond these walls. A prisoner waited in chains, breath misting in the cold, while scribes prepared their parchment to record what would unfold in this place where kings had built their justice. The tower had stood for centuries, watching London grow around its foundations like ivy around a tomb. Within these walls, the wheel of fortune turned with particular cruelty, grinding noble and commoner alike beneath its weight. Tonight, as candles burned low in their sconces and the city slept beyond the walls, another chapter would be written in blood and silence. The interrogation was about to begin, and dawn seemed impossibly far away. Chapter 1: The Shadow of Kings. Good evening, and welcome. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small. Let us drift backward in time, past the electric hum of modern nights, beyond the gaslight flicker of Victorian streets, deeper still into the candle-dark centuries where stone walls held secrets, and royal power carved itself into history with instruments of iron and blood. Wherever you are listening tonight, perhaps curled beneath soft blankets as rain patters against window glass, or walking empty streets where your footsteps echo like whispers from the past, the hour matters little. Time bends backward for stories such as these. Is it midnight in your corner of the world? 3 in the morning? The witching hour when the veil grows thin? Tell me, if you could, where this voice finds you in the darkness. Before we begin our descent into the shadowed chambers of medieval London, I must ask a small favour. If these stories of forgotten knights and ancient stones bring you comfort in the darkness, please consider subscribing to the Bedside Historian. Each subscription helps this small flame grow brighter, carrying these tales to other sleepless souls who find solace in history's darkest corners. Your support allows these voices from the past to continue their midnight whispers. Now then, let us step through time's heavy door and enter the world of the White Tower, where kings built their justice in chambers that echo still with the weight of centuries. The Thames ran black beneath February stars in the year of our Lord the 1278, its waters carrying the prayers of the dying and the dreams of the living toward the sea. Along its northern bank the White Tower stood like a pale giant against the winter sky, its limestone walls glowing faintly in the moonlight that filtered through broken clouds. William the Conqueror's vision made manifest in stone and mortar. The fortress had watched over London for 2 centuries, its presence both protection and threat to all who lived beneath its shadow. Within the tower's heart, candlelight flickered against walls that had absorbed the whispers of kings and the screams of traitors. The chambers carved from living rock beneath the royal apartment served purposes that found no mention in the chronicles monks penned for posterity. Here, in rooms where daylight never fell, the machinery of royal justice ground forward with relentless precision, transforming suspicion into confession through methods older than England itself. Brother Francis of Canterbury descended the winding stone steps, his woolen robes brushing against walls that wept moisture from the Thames beyond. The Franciscan friar carried with him the tools of his peculiar trade: parchment, quills, a horn of ink, and a leather satchel containing the implements of persuasion that had accompanied him from monastery to court. His pale hands, more accustomed to illuminating manuscripts than recording confessions, trembled slightly in the cold air that rose from the chambers below. The interrogation chamber lay at the tower's foundation level, carved directly from the chalk bedrock that London rested upon. Torches burned in iron brackets, their flames casting dancing shadows across stone walls that bore the stains of decades. The air hung thick with the scent of burning pitch, damp stone, and something else that Brother Francis tried not to name, A brazier glowed in the corner, its coals ready to heat the iron instruments that lay arranged upon a wooden table, like surgical tools awaiting a physician's hand. Thomas de Turberville stood chained to the wall, his noble bearing reduced by weeks of confinement in the tower's depths. The Welsh lord's once proud shoulders now curved forward with exhaustion, and his dark hair hung lank across a face that had grown gaunt with poor feeding and constant vigilance. Iron manacles chafed his wrists, the metal worn smooth by the movements of countless prisoners who had occupied this same position in years past. The charges against de Turberville painted him as a traitor to the crown, accused of correspondence with Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the last native prince of Wales. Edward Longshanks had spent years crushing Welsh resistance, and every real or imagined connection to the fallen prince demanded investigation. In this chamber, beneath the royal apartments where courtiers danced and feast halls rang with laughter, such investigations followed their own ancient rhythm. Sir Geoffrey de Montfort entered the chamber with measured steps, his spurs ringing against stone. The knight served as the king's interrogator, a position that required both administrative precision and physical fortitude. His weathered face bore the marks of campaigns in Wales and Scotland, and his hands carried the calluses of both sword work and darker labour. Behind him walked Master Richard, a man whose profession had no formal title, but whose services proved essential to the administration of royal justice. Brother Francis arranged his materials upon a smaller table, dipping his quill and preparing to record whatever truths or lies might emerge from the proceedings. The monastery had trained him in the scribal arts, but nothing in his religious education had prepared him for the sounds that sometimes filled these chambers. He whispered a prayer under his breath and focused his attention on the parchment before him. The interrogation began with questions posed in measured tones. Sir Geoffrey inquired about de Turberville's movements in the months before his arrest, his associations with known Welsh sympathisers, and the contents of letters that royal agents claimed to have intercepted. The Welsh lord's responses came in carefully modulated words, neither fully cooperative nor openly defiant. He maintained his innocence with the practised air of a man who understood that truth and legal truth often diverged in chambers such as these. As the night deepened beyond the tower walls, the questioning grew more persistent. Master Richard approached the brazier and selected an iron rod, testing its weight in his hands before returning it to the coals. The gesture required no explanation, and Brother Francis noticed how de Turberville's eyes followed the implement's movement. Fear, that most honest of emotions, began to replace the careful composure that noble birth and courtly training had instilled. The legal framework that governed these proceedings traced its roots through centuries of English law, but its practical application bore little resemblance to the trials conducted in sunlit halls before assembled peers. Here, in chambers where only candlelight and conscience bore witness, confessions emerged through methods that found their justification in necessity rather than precedent. The king's peace required protection, and protection sometimes demanded compromises with gentler principles. Brother Francis chronicled each exchange with careful penmanship, his letters forming neat rows across the parchment like soldiers in formation. The words he recorded would find their way into official documents, court proceedings, and ultimately the historical record that future generations would study. Yet the spaces between those words contained truths that no chronicle could capture. The quality of fear in a man's voice, the sound of iron heating in coals, the weight of silence that fell between question and answer. The chamber's architecture served its purpose with grim efficiency. Stone walls absorbed sound, preventing screams from reaching the royal apartments above or the city beyond. The ceiling, carved from solid rock, bore iron rings that had supported the weight of countless prisoners over the decades. Drainage channels cut into the floor carried away whatever needed carrying, and the chamber's location far below the Thames high tide line ensured that evidence disappeared with the river's flow. As the hours passed, de Turberville's resistance began to crack under the relentless pressure of questions, implications, and the ever-present threat of physical persuasion. Master Richard's expertise lay not in the crude application of pain, but in its careful calibration, the precise measurement of pressure required to transform stubborn silence into cooperative speech. His methods represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, passed from practitioner to practitioner like any other craft tradition. The Welsh lord's noble lineage traced back through generations of proud warriors who had defended their mountain strongholds against Saxon, Norman, and English invaders. Yet pedigree provided little protection in chambers where royal authority expressed itself through more direct means than heraldry or ceremony. De Turberville's ancestors had faced English steel on Welsh battlefields, but he confronted English justice in circumstances that offered no opportunity for honourable death or glorious defeat. Brother Francis paused in his writing to flex cramped fingers and refill his quill with ink. The parchment before him bore witness to a gradual transformation, as de Turberville's careful denial slowly gave way to partial admissions, qualified acknowledgements, and ultimately detailed confessions. The process resembled a master craftsman's work, each revelation building upon the last until a complete structure emerged from disparate elements. The interrogation's rhythm followed patterns established through decades of practice. Periods of intense questioning alternated with intervals of waiting, allowing fear to work its own persuasive magic, while Master Richard prepared his instruments, or Sir Geoffrey consulted with Brother Francis about legal precedents. These pauses served multiple purposes, giving the prisoner time to consider his situation, while demonstrating the interrogator's patience and professional detachment. Outside the chamber, the Tower of London continued its nocturnal routines. Guards walked their appointed rounds along the walls, their lanterns casting moving shadows across the Bailey's cobblestones. In the royal apartments, servants banked fires and prepared chambers for sleep, while in the city beyond, honest citizens slumbered safely beneath the protection that places like this chamber provided through their dark efficiency. The confession that finally emerged painted a picture of correspondence with Welsh rebels, secret meetings in border churches, and gold changing hands in shadowed taverns. Whether these admissions reflected actual guilt, or the prisoner's desperate attempt to provide answers that might end his ordeal, remained a question that Brother Francis dared not contemplate too deeply. His role required accurate transcription, not moral evaluation of the methods that produced the words he recorded. De Turberville's voice grew hoarse as dawn approached, his words sometimes slurring with exhaustion and pain. The chamber's air had grown thick with the accumulated breath of hours, and the torches burned lower in their brackets, their flames casting weaker shadows against stone walls that had witnessed countless similar scenes. Brother Francis found his own hand growing unsteady, the weight of the night's work pressing down upon his shoulders like lead. Master Richard cleaned his implements with careful precision, returning each tool to its designated place with the methodical attention of a craftsman maintaining his equipment. His work required constant vigilance against rust, dullness, and other forms of deterioration that might compromise effectiveness. The tools themselves bore no ornamentation or identifying marks, their plain iron construction reflecting their purely functional purpose. Sir Geoffrey reviewed the confession with professional satisfaction, noting the detailed admissions that would provide legal foundation for whatever sentence the King's justice required. The document that Brother Francis had created would serve as evidence in formal proceedings, its neat script and official seals transforming the knight's dark work into legitimate legal process. The transformation from chamber to courtroom required such careful documentation, bridging the gap between necessary methods and public justice. The prisoner's fate remained unwritten as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the tower's narrow windows. De Turberville hung exhausted in his chains, his confession complete, but his future uncertain. The wheel of royal justice would continue turning, grinding through its predetermined course until reaching whatever conclusion the King's will required. Some prisoners emerged from chambers like these to face public trial and possible reprieve, while others simply vanished into the tower's foundations, their stories ending in unmarked graves beside the Thames. Brother Francis gathered his materials with trembling hands, rolling the parchment that contained de Turberville's confession and sealing it with wax impressed by his official ring. The document would join thousands of others in the royal archives, each one representing a knight similar to this, a prisoner who had faced the machinery of royal justice in chambers carved from living stone. The accumulated weight of these records formed the foundation of English law, though few who studied legal precedents in sunlit libraries ever contemplated their dark origins. As the chamber emptied and torches guttered in their brackets, the stones themselves seemed to exhale slowly, releasing the tension that had built through the long night's work. The Tower of London settled into its daytime rhythms, its nocturnal secrets locked away behind iron doors and official silence. Soon, courtiers would walk the halls above, merchants would conduct business in the Bailey, and the machinery of royal government would resume its visible operations. But in chambers deep beneath the royal apartments, the stains on stone walls and the tools arranged on wooden tables waited patiently for another night, another prisoner, another careful documentation of the methods by which kings maintained their peace. The darkness that gathered in such places formed part of the price that civilization demanded, the shadow cast by the light of ordered society. The Bloody Tower's secrets lay deeper than any chronicle dared record, embedded in stone foundations that supported the crown itself. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Fear. The Tower of London rose from the Thames like a stone prayer to power, its foundations sunk deep into the ancient mud where Roman legions had once marched. William the Conqueror had commanded its construction in the years following Hastings, understanding that fear required architecture as much as armies. The Great White Tower stood at its heart, 90 feet of Caen stone that had been carved and carried across the Channel by masons who knew their craft would outlive empires. Within these walls, the machinery of medieval justice had evolved over 2 centuries into something far more sophisticated than the crude dungeons of earlier ages. The chambers beneath the White Tower were not accidental caverns, but carefully planned spaces, each one designed with purpose that spoke to the methodical nature of royal interrogation. Master masons had consulted with clerks who understood the requirements of extracting truth from unwilling tongues. The rooms were sized to amplify certain sounds while muffling others, their walls angled to create echoes that could drive men mad with their own voices. Water seeped through specific gaps in the masonry, creating a constant dripping that marked time like a water clock, each drop a reminder that minutes stretched into hours in the darkness below London. Stone steps descended into the earth with mathematical precision, each one slightly higher than comfort would allow, forcing visitors to stumble in their descent toward the interrogation chambers. The architects of fear understood that uncertainty began with the first unsteady step downward into spaces where natural light never penetrated. Torches burned in iron brackets set into alcoves carved with deliberate irregularity, their flames casting shadows that shifted and writhed against surfaces polished smooth by centuries of moisture and human passage. The air in these depths carried the accumulated weight of decades. Lime mortar mixed with Thames clay had been used to seal the stones, creating an atmosphere that grew thick with each breath. The scent of old rushes mingled with something metallic that had soaked into the very stone itself. Prisoners brought down these steps would taste copper on their tongues before any instrument touched their flesh, their bodies responding to the accumulated memory held within the walls themselves. Master craftsmen had installed drainage systems that served multiple purposes beyond mere function. Channels carved into the floor slopes carried away what needed carrying, but they also created spaces where sounds could travel in unexpected directions. A whisper in one chamber might emerge as a ghostly echo in another, confusing prisoners about how many people occupied these underground spaces. The tower's interrogators understood that fear lived as much in uncertainty as in pain, and the architecture itself became their ally in cultivating both. The chambers varied in size and purpose, each one fitted with specific equipment crafted by London's most skilled metalworkers. Iron rings had been forged and set into the walls at precise heights, tested to ensure they would hold against any human struggle. Chains hung from ceiling beams cut from oak trees that had grown in English forest before the conquest, their wood seasoned by age into something harder than iron itself. The metalwork showed the same attention to detail found in cathedral construction, every link and rivet examined for weakness that might allow escape or hope. Braziers stood ready in corners where the stone walls met at calculated angles, their iron construction allowing for the precise control of heat that effective interrogation required. Coal brought up from mines south of London burned with particular intensity in these confined spaces, its smoke creating an atmosphere that made breathing laborious without causing immediate unconsciousness. The interrogators had learned through experience how to use smoke as another tool in their collection, understanding that discomfort worked more effectively than agony in loosening tongues that guarded secrets. Wooden furnishings in these chambers bore the marks of master carpenters who had studied human anatomy with the same dedication shown by cathedral builders studying stone. Tables stood at heights that created maximum discomfort for those forced to lie upon them, their surfaces scarred by years of use but still solid enough to hold against any struggle. The wood had been treated with oils that resisted the moisture constantly present in these depths, ensuring that the furniture would serve its purpose for generations of royal justice. The tower's interrogation chambers also contained writing desks positioned where scribes could record proceedings without interfering with the work at hand. These clerks served as more than mere record keepers, their presence adding an element of bureaucratic permanence that transformed physical persuasion into legal process. Parchment and ink weighted on surfaces kept dry through careful placement of braziers, ready to document confessions that would later justify whatever had been required to extract them. Books bound in leather sat on wooden shelves, containing the accumulated knowledge of centuries of legal precedent and interrogation technique. These volumes recorded not just the confessions obtained within these walls, but the methods that had proven most effective in obtaining them. Master interrogators passed their knowledge to apprentices through these written records, creating a tradition as formal as any guildcraft practiced in the city above. The tower's officials had developed a careful science around the psychology of confinement and questioning. They understood that darkness worked more effectively when punctuated by sudden illumination, that silence became more oppressive when broken by unexpected sounds. The chambers contained devices that could create both, controlled by interrogators who had studied human nature with the dedication of natural philosophers, examining the movements of celestial bodies. Prisoners brought to these spaces found themselves in an environment where every element had been designed to work against their resolve. The temperature could be adjusted through careful use of braziers and deliberate opening of passages that connected to the Thames. Sounds could be amplified or muffled through the manipulation of hangings and barriers that channeled noise along specific paths. Even the timing of meals and water could be controlled to create patterns that disrupted natural rhythms and weakened resistance to questioning. The most sophisticated aspect of the tower's interrogation chambers lay not in their physical equipment, but in their psychological architecture. Master builders had created spaces that felt simultaneously vast and confining, where echoes made prisoners uncertain of their own location within the complex. Passages led between chambers in patterns that confused rather than clarified, ensuring that those brought down these steps could never be certain how far they had travelled from the world above, or how many others might be held in neighbouring spaces. Windows appeared at irregular intervals, some offering glimpses of the Thames, while others looked onto interior courtyards where daily life continued with deliberate normalcy. These calculated views served as reminders of the world that existed beyond the walls, creating hope that could be manipulated as effectively as any physical discomfort. Prisoners could see guards changing shifts, servants carrying food, and officials conducting routine business, all of it continuing while they remained suspended in the timeless space of interrogation. The Tower's officials had recognized that effective questioning required more than physical pressure. They'd created an environment where time itself became elastic, where natural rhythms disappeared into the regulated patterns of confinement and inquiry. Meals arrived at irregular intervals, sleep was interrupted according to calculated schedules, and the boundary between day and night dissolved in chambers where artificial light replaced the sun's movement across the sky. As February's cold settled deeper into the stones, the Tower's chambers took on their winter character. Moisture condensed on metal surfaces, creating patterns that changed with the temperature and humidity. The cold made every touch of iron feel like ice, while the dampness ensured that warmth, when it came, felt more precious than gold. These seasonal variations had become part of the interrogation process itself, with skilled officials timing their most important questions to coincide with moments when physical discomfort peaked. The scribes prepared their materials as another session of questioning approached, their pens sharpened and their ink mixed to the proper consistency for recording whatever truths might emerge from the darkness below London. The machinery of royal justice prepared to turn once more, its wheels grinding with the patience of stone against stone, ready to extract whatever secrets lay hidden in the hearts of those who had found themselves within the Tower's embrace. Chapter 3. The Confessor's Art. The torchlight cast long fingers across the chamber walls as Master Thomas Whitmore adjusted his leather gloves with the careful precision of a surgeon preparing for delicate work. The king's interrogator had served 3 monarchs in his time, and the lines etched deep around his eyes spoke of countless nights spent in these stone depths beneath the White Tower. His breath misted in the February cold as he examined the instruments laid out before him, with the methodical attention of a craftsman inspecting his tools. The prisoner had been brought down from the upper chambers just after midnight, when London's streets lay empty save for the watchmen making their rounds. Sir Edmund Blackwood, once a trusted knight of the realm, now found himself stripped of rank and title, accused of correspondence with enemies of the crown. His wrists bore the marks of iron shackles, and his fine doublet had been replaced with rough hemp that chafed against skin grown soft from years of court luxury. The transformation from nobleman to prisoner was complete in all but his bearing, for Blackwood held his shoulders straight despite the chains that bound him to the stone wall. Whitmore had seen such pride before. In his 30 years of service he had watched earls weep like children, and common thieves maintain dignity that would humble kings. The human spirit proved endlessly surprising in these depths, where stone and iron stripped away the pretenses of birth and station. Here, beneath the ancient foundations where William the Conqueror had first planted his standard, truth emerged as slowly and surely as water seeping through limestone. The chamber itself bore witness to centuries of such encounters. Roman stones formed the deepest foundations, recycled from structures that had crumbled when Saxon kings ruled from wooden halls. Norman masons had built upon these remains, creating chambers that would outlast the dynasties they served. The walls wept with condensation from the Thames, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the torchlight, rats scurried through passages older than memory. Master Whitmore opened the leather-bound ledger that chronicled his work, dipping his quill in ink mixed with oak gall and iron. The scratching of parchment filled the silence as he recorded the date, the prisoner's name, and the charges that had brought them to this place. Each entry followed the same careful format, for documentation served purposes beyond mere record-keeping. Should questions arise later, should kings change and policies shift, these pages would stand as testament to the Crown's justice. The art of interrogation required patience above all virtues. Whitmore had learned this truth during his apprenticeship under Master Geoffrey Blackthorne, a man whose very name had struck fear into the hearts of traitors. Blackthorne had taught him, that the mind broke more easily than the body, that fear of pain often proved more effective than pain itself. The true craft lay not in the application of instruments, but in understanding the particular weaknesses that dwelt within each human heart. Sir Edmund's weakness revealed itself in the way his eyes darted toward the narrow window set high in the chamber wall. Through that slit of stone, pale moonlight filtered down like hope itself, carrying with it the sense of the world beyond these walls. Whitmore recognised the signs. This was a man who had never known true confinement, whose spirit still believed in eventual freedom. Such hope could be useful, carefully nurtured or systematically destroyed according to the needs of justice. The questioning began with formalities: name, birth, family connections, lands held in the Crown's service. Whitmore's voice carried the measured cadence of a clerk recording tax assessments, betraying nothing of the steel that lay beneath his bureaucratic manner. Sir Edmund answered readily enough, perhaps believing that cooperation in small matters might purchase mercy in larger ones. His voice echoed strangely in the stone chamber, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As the night deepened and candles burned lower in their iron holders, Whitmore began to circle closer to the heart of the matter. The letters discovered in Sir Edmund's chambers bore seals from France, from enemies who sought to undermine the realm's stability. The knight's explanations grew more elaborate, more desperate, as dawn crept slowly toward the narrow window. He spoke of old friendships, of innocent correspondence, of misunderstandings that could be easily resolved once proper authorities examined the evidence. The scribe's pen continued its steady scratching across parchment, recording every word, every pause, every protestation of innocence. In the morning, these pages would be carried to chambers where men in velvet robes would study each line for signs of truth or deception. The written word possessed power in this realm, where literacy remained rare and documents bore the weight of divine authority. What was written became real in ways that spoken words could never achieve. Whitmore rose from his chair with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested against the chamber's damp cold. He approached the wall, where instruments hung in neat rows, each tool designed for specific purposes, crafted by smiths who understood their dark art. The sight of these devices often proved sufficient to loosen tongues that had remained stubbornly silent. Fear, he had learned, accomplished more than force ever could. Sir Edmund's breathing quickened as the interrogator's shadow fell across him. The chains that held him to the wall clinked softly with each tremor that ran through his frame. His noble education had prepared him for warfare, for diplomacy, for the complex dance of court politics, but nothing in his privileged existence had prepared him for this moment, when his very life hung suspended by the threads of truth and lies. The confession came slowly, drawn out like thread from a spindle. Names emerged from Sir Edmund's lips, names of other knights, of merchants, of clerks who had access to the crown's secrets. Each revelation brought him another hour of life, another postponement of the final judgment that awaited in the chamber above. Whitmore recorded each word with the dispassionate accuracy of a natural philosopher, documenting the movement of celestial bodies. By the time dawn light began to strengthen at the window, the ledger contained enough evidence to condemn a dozen men to the headsman's block. Sir Edmund slumped against his chains, emptied of secrets as completely as a wineskin drained of its contents. The interrogation had run its course, achieving what violence might have accomplished in moments, but with the methodical thoroughness that justice demanded. The guards who came to escort the prisoner back to his cell moved with the quiet efficiency of men who had performed such duties countless times before. Their faces revealed nothing of what they had witnessed in the chamber, for discretion formed an essential part of their service to the crown. What transpired in these depths remained buried as deeply as the Roman stones that formed the tower's foundations. Master Whitmore closed his ledger and gathered his instruments with the same careful attention he had shown when laying them out. Each tool returned to its designated place, cleaned and ready for the next occasion when the crown's justice required their services. The chamber fell silent save for the eternal dripping of water and the distant sound of London awakening to another day of ordinary life beyond the tower's walls. As he climbed the narrow stone steps that led back toward the world of sunlight and fresh air, Whitmore reflected on the night's work with the satisfaction of a craftsman who had plied his trade with skill and precision. Truth had been extracted, justice had been served, and the realm stood a little safer for his efforts. The burden of such knowledge weighed heavily on his shoulders, but duty demanded its price from all who served the crown faithfully. The confessor's art would continue as long as men harboured secrets that threatened the peace of kingdoms, and Master Thomas Whitmore would continue to practice that art until age or death released him from its demands. Behind him, the chamber waited in darkness, patient as stone, ready to receive whatever prisoners the next turn of fortune's wheel might deliver to its cold embrace. Chapter 4. The Art of Truth. The winter of 1381 had settled upon London like a shroud, wrapping the tower in mist that rose from the Thames and clung to the ancient stones with persistent fingers. In the depths of the White Tower, far beneath the chambers where kings once held court, the machinery of justice ground forward with methodical precision. The rebellion that had shaken England to its foundations had been crushed, but its echoes still reverberated through the corridors of power, and those echoes demanded answers. Brother Thomas Whitmore stood in chains before the instruments that would extract those answers. A Benedictine monk whose hands had once been stained only with ink from illuminated manuscripts, he now found himself accused of blessing the rebels' cause and providing sanctuary to those who had dared to challenge the natural order. The irony was not lost on him that a man who had dedicated his life to copying the word of God would now face judgment in a chamber where truth was carved from flesh, rather than discovered through prayer and contemplation. The interrogation chamber in the tower's basement had been constructed during the reign of King John, when the need for extracting confessions from traitors and heretics had become a matter of state necessity. The walls were built of dressed stone, each block fitted with the precision that marked Norman craftsmanship. Iron rings had been driven deep into the mortar, positioned at heights that spoke to their grim purpose. Torches burned in wall sconces, their flames casting shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own, while the smoke rose toward a ceiling blackened by decades of such proceedings. The keeper of the tower's dungeons was a man named Edmund Blackwood, whose family had served the crown in this capacity for 3 generations. His grandfather had overseen the questioning of suspected witches during the reign of Edward III, while his father had perfected techniques for extracting confessions from French spies during the endless wars that had consumed the treasury and the flower of English nobility. Edmund himself had learned his craft through careful observation and methodical practice, understanding that the art of interrogation lay not in mindless brutality, but in the precise application of pressure at carefully chosen moments. The chamber contained instruments that bore no resemblance to the tools of honest trades. The rack dominated one corner, its wooden frame worn smooth by countless hands, and stained dark with substances that the torchlight mercifully obscured. Iron wheels and pulleys created a mechanism of terrible efficiency, designed to stretch the human form beyond its natural limits, while preserving life and consciousness for as long as possible. Beside it stood the strappado, a simpler device that relied upon rope and gravity to achieve its purpose, suspending victims by their wrists while weights were added to their ankles until joints separated, with sounds that echoed through the stone chambers like the breaking of dry branches. The screw and thumbscrew occupied a wooden table that had once graced the hall of a minor lord before finding its way to this darker purpose. These instruments required no great strength to operate, only patience and an understanding of the precise pressure needed to transform bone into powder while leaving the victim capable of speech. The brazier glowed cherry red in the corner, its coals tended by an assistant whose face remained hidden beneath a leather hood. the tools that rested among the embers shaped for purposes that had no names in civilized discourse. Brother Thomas had been brought to the tower on a February morning when frost clung to the cobblestones and the Thames ran grey beneath a sky the colour of old pewter. The journey from Westminster had taken him through streets where the scaffold still stood from the previous autumn's executions, their timbers weathered by winter rains, but still solid enough to serve their purpose when spring brought fresh conspiracies to light. Citizens had gathered to watch his passage, some crossing themselves at the sight of a monk in chains, others shouting curses and demanding immediate justice for his alleged crimes. The charges against him had been read in the chamber above before his descent into these depths: treason against the crown of England, providing aid and comfort to rebels, spreading seditious doctrine contrary to the established order of church and state. Each accusation carried the penalty of death, but death would come only after truth had been extracted through whatever means necessity demanded. The Crown's justice required not merely punishment but understanding, a complete mapping of the conspiracy that had threatened to topple the realm. Sir Geoffrey Hartwell served as the Crown's examiner, a man whose legal education at Oxford had been supplemented by years of practical experience in extracting confessions from enemies of the realm. His robes were cut from fine wool dyed deep blue, marked with the symbols of his office and authority. A thin man with grey eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of the scene before him, he carried himself with the bearing of one who understood that his work served a purpose higher than personal satisfaction. The realm's security depended upon information, and information flowed most freely when proper incentives were applied. The examination began with questions posed in Latin, the language of learning and the church. Brother Thomas responded in kind, his voice steady despite the chains that bound his wrists, and the knowledge of what awaited him if his answers proved unsatisfactory. The preliminary questioning established his identity, his position within the monastery, his connections to those who had already confessed under similar circumstances. Each response was carefully recorded by scribes whose pens scratched against parchment, with sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the stone chamber. As the questioning progressed, the temperature of the inquiry began to rise. Sir Geoffrey's voice remained level and professional, but the nature of his questions grew more specific, more demanding. Names were required, dates, details of meetings and conversations, the location of hidden correspondence, the identities of nobles who might have provided financial support to the rebellion. Brother Thomas maintained his innocence with the stubborn persistence of a man whose faith had been tested in less dramatic circumstances. But the examiner's patience was not infinite. The first application of pressure came through the thumbscrew, its iron jaws closing around digits that had spent decades copying sacred texts and illuminating the margins of prayer books with gold leaf and precious pigments. The mechanism turned with mechanical precision, each quarter revolution accompanied by questions that grew more urgent as the monk's composure began to crack. The pain started as pressure, developed into crushing agony, and finally transcended physical sensation to become something that existed in realms beyond the merely corporeal. Still, Brother Thomas maintained his denials, though sweat had begun to bead upon his forehead despite the chamber's winter chill. Sir Geoffrey nodded to Edmund Blackwood, who moved with practiced efficiency to prepare the strappado. Ropes were secured to iron rings driven deep into the chamber's ceiling, their fibres worn smooth by previous use, but still strong enough to bear the weight they would soon support. The monk's hands were bound behind his back with leather thongs that bit deep into flesh, already abraded by iron shackles. The ascent began slowly, the rope drawing taut as Brother Thomas was lifted from the stone floor. At first, the position merely caused discomfort, his arms drawn back at an unnatural angle, but still within the bounds of human endurance. Then came the addition of weights to his ankles, iron masses that transformed discomfort into genuine torment as his shoulders began to separate from their sockets with small poppings that echoed through the chamber like the sound of green wood thrown upon a fire. The questioning continued throughout the process, Sir Geoffrey's voice maintaining its professional calm while the monk swayed gently in his bonds, his responses becoming increasingly fragmented as pain overwhelmed his capacity for coherent thought. Names began to emerge, whispered confessions of meetings held in monastery cells and conversations conducted in the shadows of cathedral naves. The rebellion had indeed found support among certain members of the clergy, men who had confused Christian charity with political sedition and paid for their error with liberty and life. As the night wore on, the examination revealed the extent of the conspiracy that had threatened the crown. Brother Thomas spoke of secret correspondence carried by travelling friars, of gold hidden beneath altar stones, of weapons blessed by priests who believed they served God's will in challenging the established order. Each revelation was carefully recorded, the information that flowed from his lips becoming part of the vast web of intelligence that the Crown's agents would use to identify and eliminate the remaining conspirators. The monk's resistance finally crumbled near dawn, when exhaustion and agony had combined to strip away the last vestiges of his resolve. He spoke of meetings in abbey scriptoriums where plans had been made to coordinate the rebellion with sympathetic elements among the nobility. He named names that would send Crown agents racing across the countryside to make arrests before word of his confession could spread. He revealed hiding places where documents and treasure had been concealed against the day when the established order would fall. When the confession was complete and properly witnessed, Brother Thomas was lowered to the stone floor where he collapsed like a marionette whose strings had been severed. His shoulders would never again possess their full strength, and his hands bore marks that would remain until his dying day. Yet he had served truth in his fashion, providing the crown with intelligence that would protect the realm from future conspiracies, while purchasing his own life with information that condemned dozens of his former allies. Sir Geoffrey gathered the parchments that contained the night's revelations, their surfaces covered with neat Latin script that transformed screams into evidence and agony into legal documentation. The confession would be forwarded to Westminster, where it would join the growing collection of testimonies that mapped the full extent of the rebellion's reach. Justice would follow, swift and certain, as those named in the monk's testimony were brought to account for their crimes against the crown. As morning light began to filter through the narrow windows high in the chamber walls, the instruments of interrogation were cleaned and returned to their proper positions. The brazier was banked, its coals covered with ash to preserve them for future use. The rack and strapado stood ready for the next examination, their mechanisms oiled and adjusted for optimal performance. In a few hours, the chamber would likely host another inquiry, as the Crown's agents worked to unravel every thread of the conspiracy that had threatened England's stability. Brother Thomas was returned to his cell, where he would await the final disposition of his case. His confession had earned him a measure of mercy, transforming his likely sentence from the agonizing death reserved for traitors to the swifter end that awaited common criminals. The Wheel of Fortune continued its eternal revolution, carrying some men to power and glory while crushing others beneath its inexorable weight. The tower's stones had witnessed another night's work in the service of crown and realm, adding fresh chapters to the long history written in these chambers, where truth was extracted through methods that kings preferred not to contemplate but found necessary to employ. Outside the walls, London was waking to another day, its citizens unaware of the intelligence that had been gathered in darkness to preserve their peace and security. Chapter 5. The Arithmetic of Pain. The morning bells of St. Peter ad Vincula had not yet rung when Master John Foxley descended the narrow stone steps that wound into the bowels of the White Tower. His leather satchel, worn smooth by decades of service, contained the tools of his peculiar trade. The keys at his belt jangled softly against the cold stones as he made his way through passages that had known 6 centuries of secrets. February's grip tightened around the tower like iron bands, and frost painted delicate patterns on the walls where moisture had gathered and frozen in the night. The torches in their sconces burned with a steady yellow flame, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and whisper in the confined spaces. Somewhere in the darkness below, water dripped with the endless patience of stone wearing away stone, marking time in a place where time itself seemed suspended between life and eternity. Master Foxley paused at the iron door that separated the world of daylight from the realm where the Crown's justice took its most particular forms. The door bore no inscription, no mark to distinguish it from any other in the tower's labyrinth, yet every soul who served within these walls knew what lay beyond. He inserted the largest of his keys, feeling the ancient mechanism turn with the grinding reluctance of metal against metal. The door swung inward on hinges that had been oiled just the previous evening, for silence was often as important as any instrument in the chamber beyond. The air that greeted him carried the weight of centuries. It tasted of old stone and older fears, of iron and leather, and the peculiar dampness that rose from the Thames and seeped through foundations that had been laid when Norman masons still spoke in tongues their Saxon subjects could not comprehend. Candles flickered in their holders along the walls, their flames steady in the still air, illuminating a space that existed in the gap between law and necessity, between justice and expedience. The chamber stretched perhaps 20 paces in length, and half that in width, its ceiling arched in the Norman manner with ribs of stone that drew the eye upward into shadowed vaults. Along one wall stood a table of heavy oak, its surface marked by years of use, bearing parchment and quills, an inkwell, and small brass scales for weighing evidence. 2 scribes waited there already, their faces pale in the candlelight, their hands steady despite the cold that made breath visible in small clouds. Against the far wall, arranged with the careful precision of a master craftsman's workshop, stood the instruments that had no names in polite discourse. The rack, built of seasoned oak and iron, lay ready like some great mechanical prayer wheel designed for purposes that would have horrified its monastic inventors. Beside it, smaller devices waited in neat rows, thumbscrews polished to gleaming, the Duke of Exeter's daughter with her iron embrace, manacles and chains arranged according to size and purpose, like the tools of any honest trade. The prisoner had been brought down before dawn, when the city still slept, and only the guards walked their rounds along the walls. Sir Thomas Winford, once a knight of considerable standing, now sat shackled to a wooden chair that had been bolted to the stone floor. His clothing, though still fine, bore the stains and wrinkles of imprisonment. His face, pale from weeks in the tower's custody, showed the particular exhaustion that came not from physical labour, but from the grinding weight of uncertainty. The charges against Sir Thomas were both simple and complex in the manner of all matters that touched upon treason. Letters had been discovered, correspondence that suggested sympathies with certain foreign powers, at a time when His Majesty's government viewed such sympathies with particular suspicion. The handwriting had been examined by learned men who pronounced it genuine. The seals bore the marks of authenticity. Yet Sir Thomas maintained his innocence with the stubborn persistence of a man who had nothing left to lose save his honour and his life. Master Foxley moved with the unhurried precision of long experience, lighting additional candles from the flame of his torch until the chamber glowed with steady light. The shadows retreated but did not disappear, lingering in corners and crevices like watching spirits. He removed his heavy cloak and hung it on a peg driven into the stone wall, then opened his leather satchel and began to arrange its contents on the oak table, with the methodical care of a natural philosopher preparing an experiment. The morning progressed with the slow rhythm of ritual. Documents were read aloud in the measured tones of clerks who had performed this duty countless times before. Sir Thomas listened without comment, his breathing visible in small puffs of mist that rose and dissipated in the still air. The charges were formal, couched in the elaborate language of the law, yet their meaning was clear enough. Correspondence with foreign agents, discussion of matters touching upon the security of the realm. failure to report suspicious contacts to the proper authorities. When the reading concluded, Master Foxley approached the prisoner with the patience of a craftsman who understood that haste spoiled the finest work. He carried with him a leather portfolio containing documents that bore the royal seal, authorization for the proceedings that would follow. The parchment crackled softly as he unfolded it, the sound sharp in the quiet chamber. The first questions came gently, almost conversationally, as if master and prisoner sat by a fireside rather than in the depth of the tower. Sir Thomas was invited to explain certain passages in the intercepted letters, to clarify meetings that had been observed and reported by loyal subjects of the crown. His answers came slowly, carefully considered, maintaining the position he had held since his arrest. The letters were forgeries, the meetings were innocent encounters, the witnesses were mistaken or malicious. Master Foxley nodded at each response, making notes on a sheet of parchment with a quill that scratched softly across the surface. His manner remained courteous, almost regretful, as if the necessity of these proceedings caused him personal distress. He had performed this work for more than 20 years, serving under 3 different monarchs, and had learned that cruelty without purpose served no one. The tower's reputation for extracting truth depended not upon savage brutality, but upon the careful application of pressure, physical and otherwise, until resistance crumbled like mortar exposed to too many seasons of frost and rain. The morning wore toward midday, marked not by bells but by the gradual change in the quality of light that filtered down through narrow windows set high in the chamber walls. The questions continued, growing more specific, more pointed, accompanied now by the soft rustle of additional documents being produced from Master Foxley's seemingly inexhaustible supply. Letters in Sir Thomas's own hand dating back months and years, records of his movements, testimonies from servants who had observed strange comings and goings at his manor house. Sir Thomas's composure began to show the first hairline cracks of strain. His responses came more quickly now, with less consideration, and Master Foxley noted each variation in tone and timing. The experienced interrogator could read the signs as clearly as a navigator read the stars, the slight tensing of muscles when a particular name was mentioned, the pause that lasted just a moment too long when asked about a specific date, the way the prisoner's eyes moved to avoid looking directly at certain documents. The chamber grew colder as the day progressed, despite the burning candles. The stone walls seemed to absorb warmth as readily as they absorbed sound, creating an atmosphere that pressed in upon the occupants like the weight of the ages. Master Foxley rose from his chair and moved to warm his hands over one of the larger candles, using the movement to study his subject from a different angle. Sir Thomas sat hunched forward now, his breath coming in shorter puffs, his hands clasped tightly in his lap despite the manacles that bound his wrists. The afternoon brought a change in tactics, subtle as the shifting of shadows on the wall. Master Foxley began to speak of other cases, other prisoners who had found themselves in similar circumstances. His voice remained conversational, almost gentle, as he described the choices that had been made and their consequences. Some had chosen cooperation, confessing their involvement in exchange for the Crown's mercy. Their executions had been swift, their families permitted to retain at least a portion of their estates. Others had maintained their innocence to the bitter end, suffering prolonged interrogation before meeting deaths that had been more elaborate. The prisoner listened to these accounts with growing pallor, understanding the message beneath Master Foxley's calm recitation. The tower's records were filled with precedents, each case establishing principles that governed how such matters were handled. Cooperation brought certain benefits. Obstinate denial brought certain consequences. The choice, Master Foxley explained with gentle reasonableness, lay entirely with Sir Thomas himself. As the daylight began to fade beyond the narrow windows, Master Foxley finally rose from his chair and moved to examine the instruments that waited against the far wall. He touched nothing, merely studied each device with the critical eye of a craftsman evaluating his tools. The rack gleamed dully in the candlelight, its wooden frame worn smooth by use, its iron fittings carefully maintained and recently oiled. The smaller instruments hung in their appointed places, each designed for a specific purpose, together comprising a library of persuasion that had been refined over generations of use. Sir Thomas followed these movements with growing horror, understanding that the gentle morning of questions had been merely the prelude to possibilities far more terrible. His breathing quickened, and for the first time since being brought to the chamber, he spoke without being asked a direct question. His voice emerged as little more than a whisper, barely audible above the soft dripping of condensation from the stone ceiling. He wished to reconsider his previous answers, he said. Perhaps there were details he had overlooked, nuances that required clarification. The letters that he had dismissed as forgeries might indeed bear closer examination. The meetings he had characterized as innocent encounters might have carried implications that had escaped his notice at the time. Master Foxley turned from his contemplation of the instruments with an expression of mild interest. He returned to his chair and took up his quill, dipping it carefully in the inkwell before looking expectantly at his subject. The scribes at their tables straightened, preparing fresh sheets of parchment. The candles burned steadily in their holders, marking the passage of time with the patient accumulation of wax in the holders below. The confession that followed came in fits and starts, like water breaking through a dam that had been weakened by the persistent pressure of countless small streams. Sir Thomas spoke of contacts made through intermediaries, of conversations that had begun as idle speculation about the state of the realm and gradually evolved into something more purposeful. Names were mentioned, meetings described, payments acknowledged. The scribes' quills scratched steadily across their parchment, recording each admission in the careful script that would later be reviewed by judges and justices. The shadows lengthened as evening approached, and servants arrived to light fresh candles and tend to the guttering flames of those that had burned low. The confession continued through the changing of the light, each revelation leading naturally to the next, like stones tumbling down a hillside once the first had been dislodged. Master Foxley guided the flow with occasional questions, clarifying dates and details, ensuring that the record would be complete and internally consistent. By the time the bells of St. Peter ad Vincula rang for evening prayers, the work of the day was complete. Sir Thomas sat slumped in his chair, exhausted by the dual burden of confession and relief. The immediate threat of physical persuasion had passed, replaced by the slower but no less certain progress toward a scaffold that would be erected in due course, according to the forms prescribed by law and custom. The documents were gathered, sealed, and prepared for delivery to the appropriate authorities. Sir Thomas was returned to his cell in the Beauchamp Tower, where he would await the king's pleasure regarding his ultimate fate. Master Foxley packed his instruments with the same methodical care he had shown in arranging them. Each tool returned to its appointed place in his leather satchel. The chamber fell quiet as the last of the candles was extinguished, leaving only the single torch that burned by the iron door to mark the entrance to this place where the Crown's justice took its most particular forms. The shadows crept back across the stone floor like patient servants returning to their posts, and the ancient stones settled with small sounds that might have been sighs. Another day's work was finished in the tower, and the Thames flowed past its walls as it had for centuries, carrying away secrets and sorrows toward the distant sea. Chapter 6. The Art of Truth. The tower's interrogation chambers occupied the deepest levels of the White Tower, carved into bedrock that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties. Here, where the Thames' ancient currents had once lapped against primordial shores, stonemasons had hewn rooms designed for a single purpose: extracting truth from unwilling tongues. The walls wept moisture that never dried, and torchlight cast shadows that seemed to writhe with memories of countless confessions wrung from flesh and bone. Master Interrogator Thomas de Cobham descended the narrow stairs with measured steps, his leather boots echoing against stone worn smooth by centuries of similar journeys. The keys at his belt chimed softly with each movement, a delicate counterpoint to the heavy breathing that echoed from the chamber below. De Cobham had served 3 kings in this capacity, his reputation built upon an understanding that information extracted through pain often proved less reliable than that coaxed through patience and psychological manipulation. Yet the tower's instruments remained, waiting in their ordained places should gentler methods fail. The chamber itself stretched 20 paces from wall to wall, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that no amount of torchlight could fully penetrate. Iron rings set into the walls bore the rust stains of countless chains, while channels cut into the floor directed blood and other fluids toward drains that led ultimately to the Thames. The air hung thick with the accumulated scent of fear, a perfume that had saturated these stones until it became part of their very essence. Upon a wooden table against the far wall lay the instruments of persuasion, each crafted by smiths who understood their purpose with intimate precision. The thumbscrews gleamed dully in the torchlight, their threads cut to bite slowly but inexorably into flesh and bone. Beside them rested pincers of various sizes, their jaws shaped to grip fingers, toes, or more sensitive anatomy with unrelenting pressure. A brazier glowed in the corner, its coals maintained at the perfect temperature to heat iron until it glowed white-hot against the darkness. The rack dominated the chamber's centre, its wooden frame polished smooth by the struggles of countless victims. Ropes ran through pulleys mounted at head and foot, designed to stretch the human form beyond its natural limits with mechanical precision. The device bore no ornament save functional beauty, its creator's understanding that terror lay not in decoration, but in the mind's ability to comprehend the methodical destruction that awaited. Sir Geoffrey de Montfort awaited his interrogation in chains that had been forged in the tower's own smithy, their weight calculated to exhaust without preventing speech. Accused of correspondence with enemies of the crown, he maintained his innocence with the stubborn dignity of nobility bred to command. Yet here, beneath layers of stone that muffled even the strongest cry, noble blood offered no protection from the instruments of royal justice. De Cobham approached the prisoner with professional detachment, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Years of experience had taught him that haste bred mistakes, while patience often yielded confessions before instruments need be employed. He carried a scroll containing the specific accusations, each charge precisely worded according to legal tradition that stretched back through centuries of English jurisprudence. The interrogation began with questions posed in Latin, the language of educated discourse that marked both prisoner and questioner as men of learning. De Montfort's responses came measured and careful, his voice steady despite the circumstances that surrounded him. He spoke of loyalty to the crown, of service rendered in foreign campaigns, of wounds taken in defence of English soil. His words painted a portrait of faithful service that might have carried weight in any court save this one, where suspicion had already hardened into certainty. As the questions continued, scribes seated at a smaller table recorded each exchange with careful precision. Their quills scratched against parchment in rhythm with the interrogation's flow, creating a permanent record that would outlive both questioner and questioned. The law demanded such documentation, understanding that torture's temporary agonies must be balanced by written testimony that could withstand future scrutiny. De Cobham's voice remained level as he presented evidence gathered by the Crown's agents, letters intercepted by royal messengers, testimony from servants who claimed knowledge of secret meetings, gold coins bearing foreign marks found among the accused man's possessions. Each piece formed part of a tapestry that depicted treason. Though viewed individually, none proved damning beyond reasonable doubt. The prisoner's denials grew more strained as evidence accumulated before him like stones in an executioner's cart. Sweat beaded upon his forehead despite the chamber's chill, and his breathing quickened with each new accusation. Yet he maintained his protestation of innocence, his voice carrying the conviction of either absolute truth or practiced deception. Hours passed in this manner, marked only by the changing angle of torchlight and the gradual exhaustion that crept across the prisoner's features. De Cobham allowed silence to stretch between questions, understanding that emptiness could prove as effective as direct pressure. In these pauses, the chamber's ambient sounds grew prominent. Water dripping from unseen sources, the distant murmur of Thames currents, the soft scratching of scribes' quills across parchment. The interrogator finally rose from his wooden stool, his movement causing chains to rattle and shadows to dance across stone walls. He approached the table bearing instruments with deliberate slowness, allowing the prisoner's imagination to work upon possibilities that awaited. His fingers traced the edge of a thumbscrew with professional appreciation, testing its threads and examining its construction as a master craftsman might evaluate another's work. De Montfort's composure finally cracked as metal clicked against metal, the sound echoing through the chamber with promise of agonies to come. His voice, when he spoke again, carried a tremor that had been absent during hours of verbal sparring. Yet still he maintained innocence, his words tumbling forth in desperate torrents that spoke of family honour, of service to the realm, of loyalty that transcended mere survival. The first application of physical persuasion came not through the grand instruments that dominated the chamber, but through simple techniques refined over generations. A rope tightened around the prisoner's chest, restricting breath until consciousness wavered at the edge of darkness. Water, cold from winter cisterns, cascaded over face and form until shivering became convulsions that threatened to snap bone against stone. Between applications of discomfort, questions continued their measured pace. De Cobham's voice never rose beyond conversational tones, his manner suggesting that cooperation might yet spare further unpleasantness. The scribes continued their documentation, recording not merely words but observations of the prisoner's condition, noting changes in demeanour that might prove significant during later legal proceedings. As midnight approached, marked by bells tolling across sleeping London, the interrogation entered its most crucial phase. The prisoner's resistance had worn thin under hours of psychological pressure and physical discomfort, yet no confession had emerged to satisfy his questioners. De Cobham faced the decision that defined his professional skill, whether to escalate toward more severe methods or continue the patient wearing away of will through lesser means. The choice reflected deeper questions about the nature of truth itself. Did information extracted through extreme duress carry the same weight as voluntary confession? Could the Crown's justice rest upon testimony wrung from bodies pushed beyond endurance? These philosophical concerns mattered less than immediate practical needs. The realm demanded answers, and the prisoner possessed knowledge that might save or doom others caught in webs of suspected treason. The rack's ropes creaked as they took the prisoner's weight, stretching limbs toward their natural limits while maintaining tension just short of dislocation. Pain flowed through nerve pathways designed to warn of damage, becoming a constant companion that coloured every thought and breath. Yet even now, consciousness remained clear enough to form words, to make choices between truth and continued agony. De Montfort's voice, when confession finally came, bore little resemblance to the assured tones that had marked the evening's beginning. Words emerged in broken fragments, admissions of contact with foreign agents mixed with pleas for mercy that had no place in chambers designed for extraction rather than absolution. The scribes worked faster now, capturing details that painted pictures of conspiracy reaching far beyond a single nobleman's guilt. Names spilled forth like water from a broken dam, merchants who carried messages, clergy who blessed treasonous endeavours, nobles who gathered in secret chambers to discuss the crown's overthrow. Each revelation opened new avenues for investigation, new prisoners to be brought before similar instruments in pursuit of larger truths. The confession became a map of sedition that would guide royal agents through coming months of arrests and trials. As dawn approached, marked by subtle changes in the air that penetrated even these depths, the interrogation drew toward its close. The prisoner hung limp in his restraints, voice reduced to whispers that barely carried across stone floors. De Cobham consulted with the scribes, ensuring that all relevant details had been properly recorded and that no questions remained unanswered. The confession would be read before judges in daylight courts, its words carrying weight that might determine not merely the prisoner's fate, but the course of political events that stretched far beyond the tower's walls. What had begun as investigation of a single man's loyalty had expanded into evidence of broader conspiracy that threatened the realm's stability. Guards arrived to return the prisoner to his cell, their movements efficient and without unnecessary roughness. Professional courtesy extended even to condemned men, recognition that today's enemy might be tomorrow's ally should political winds shift direction. The chamber fell silent save for dripping water and the soft sound of torches consuming themselves in pursuit of light. De Cobham gathered his materials with the same methodical care that had marked the evening's proceedings. Each instrument returned to its designated place, positioned for future use when other prisoners required similar persuasion. The scribes rolled their parchments carefully, ensuring that precious confessions remained protected against moisture that might blur crucial details. The stairs seemed longer during ascent, each step carrying interrogator and scribes away from chambers where truth and falsehood blended in proportions that only God could measure with perfect accuracy. Behind them, shadows reclaimed spaces briefly illuminated by torch flame, while silence settled over stones that had witnessed humanity's capacity for both cruelty and justice. In the tower's upper reaches, morning light began to filter through arrow-slits that had once served defensive purposes, but now provided only glimpses of the world beyond. London stirred to life beyond the walls, merchants opening shops and servants beginning daily routines that continued regardless of dramas played out in darkness below their feet. The city's heartbeat pulsed with rhythms older than any individual life, carrying forward the story of a realm that demanded loyalty and extracted it through methods both gentle and harsh. The confession would soon make its way to royal chambers where decisions awaited that might reshape the political landscape. In the meantime, the tower's depths remained ready for whatever truths the next evening might require, patient as stone and inexorable as Thames tides that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms built upon foundations of blood, faith, and the eternal human struggle between conscience and survival. Chapter 7. The King's Justice and the Merchant's Gold. The winter of 1468 settled over London like a shroud, and within the tower's walls the machinery of royal justice turned with methodical precision. King Edward IV had claimed his throne through blood and steel, and now the delicate work of consolidating power required different tools altogether. In the depths of the White Tower, where Norman stone met Tudor ambition, the instruments of interrogation waited in chambers that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties. Thomas Cook had built his fortune thread by thread, bolt by bolt, transforming raw silk into the golden tapestries that adorned noble halls across England. His warehouses along Thames Street groaned with Flemish cloth and Venetian luxury, while his counting houses recorded the steady accumulation of wealth that placed him among London's merchant princes. Yet in this February darkness, chains held him fast to stone, and his silk-soft hands bore the marks of iron manacles. The merchant's crime existed in the shadowy realm where commerce met treason, where loyalty to purse might conflict with loyalty to crown. Edward's spies had whispered of secret correspondence, of gold flowing to Lancastrian exiles across the narrow sea. Whether Cook's ledgers recorded mere business, or something approaching rebellion remained for the tower's interrogators to discover. In chambers below the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where royal blood had already stained ancient stone, the king's men prepared their questions. Brother Benedict of the tower's chaplaincy moved through corridors that morning, with the measured pace of one who had witnessed too much of earthly justice. The Benedictine's robes whispered against stone as he carried the sacred oils that might soon be needed, his prayers ascending through arched ceilings toward heaven. The chaplain understood his role in this dance of power and punishment, offering spiritual comfort to souls about to face the king's pleasure, whatever form that pleasure might take. In the chamber of examination, Master Geoffrey Hartwell arranged his instruments with the precision of a surgeon preparing for delicate work. The king's interrogator possessed hands that could draw confession from stone itself, fingers trained in arts that left no permanent mark yet extracted truth more effectively than any blade. His tools bore no resemblance to the crude implements of common torturers, being instead refined instruments of persuasion designed for gentlemen who might yet return to society. The February dawn crept slowly across the Thames, painting Tower Hill in shades of pearl and ash. Within the fortress, servants moved about their morning duties while guards changed watch with military precision. The great bell of St. Peter's marked the canonical hours, its bronze voice carrying across courtyards where ravens pecked at frost-hardened earth. In kitchens and stables, laundries and armories, the tower's daily life continued while darker business unfolded in chambers far below. Thomas Cook had awakened to find his wrists raw from the iron that held him, his breath misting in air that carried the Thames's dampness through stone walls centuries old. The merchant's mind turned not to prayer or despair, but to calculation, weighing the value of secrets against the price of revelation. His fortune might purchase freedom, or it might purchase only a swifter end to questioning that could stretch across many days. Master Hartwell entered the chamber as morning light filtered through arrow-slits cut in walls, thick as a man's outstretched arms. The interrogator carried parchment and quills, ink that would record whatever truths emerged from their conversation. Behind him walked Brother Benedict, whose presence sanctified what was about to unfold, transforming mere questioning into something approaching divine judgment. The merchant raised his head as chains permitted, studying the faces of men who held his fate. Hartwell possessed the lean features of a scholar, with eyes that missed nothing and hands that moved with careful deliberation. The chaplain's face bore the serene expression of one who had made peace with earthly suffering, finding in pain a pathway toward celestial understanding. "Master Cook," Hartwell began, his voice carrying the educated accents of a man trained in law, as well as more practical arts. "His Majesty's concern touches upon certain irregularities in your commercial correspondence. Perhaps we might begin with your recent transactions involving Flemish merchants." The questioning commenced with gentle precision, each inquiry building upon the last like stones in a careful wall. Cook's answers came slowly, weighted with the caution of a man who understood that words once spoken could never be recalled. The merchant detailed his business with cloth merchants in Bruges and Ghent, describing transactions that had brought English silver across the Channel in exchange for luxury goods that adorned the halls of nobility. Brother Benedict maintained his silent vigil, marking each response with the attention of a confessor hearing final absolution. The chaplain's presence transformed the chamber into something approaching a courtroom, where earthly justice sought divine approval. His prayers rose silently toward heaven, asking blessing upon whatever truths might emerge from this encounter between royal power and merchant wealth. As morning progressed toward midday, the questioning grew more pointed, focusing upon specific names and dates that appeared in Cook's business correspondence. Hartwell produced documents bearing the merchant's seal, letters that spoke of payments to individuals whose loyalty to Edward's crown appeared questionable. The interrogator's voice remained calm, professional, as he guided Cook through the labyrinth of commercial relationships that might conceal treasonous intent. The merchant's responses grew shorter, more carefully considered. His wealth had been built upon understanding the true value of information, knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. Yet the chamber's atmosphere pressed upon him like Thames fog. heavy with implications that extended far beyond mere commercial irregularities. In this place where royal justice took its most intimate form, words carried weight that could crush men as surely as the tower's stones. Master Hartwell's instruments remained untouched upon their table, polished steel catching torchlight like frozen prayers. The interrogator understood that fear of pain often proved more effective than pain itself, that imagination could accomplish what physical persuasion might fail to achieve. Cook's eyes moved periodically to those waiting tools, reading in their silent presence the full extent of royal determination. Brother Benedict marked the passage of hours with quiet prayers, his lips moving in Latin benedictions that seemed to sanctify the proceeding. The chaplain's role extended beyond mere spiritual comfort, encompassing the preservation of proper form in matters touching upon royal justice. His presence ensured that whatever unfolded in this chamber would bear the seal of divine approval, transforming earthly judgment into something approaching sacred duty. The merchant's story emerged piece by careful piece, revealing the complex web of relationships that bound London's commercial elite to continental politics. Cook detailed payments that might have been mere business expenses, or might have represented something approaching treasonous conspiracy. His words painted pictures of meetings in Flemish taverns, of whispered conversations that touched upon English politics, of gold that flowed in channels that might serve Lancastrian hopes. As afternoon shadows lengthened across tower courtyards, the questioning reached its crucial phase. Hartwell's voice maintained its scholarly tone as he pressed Cook regarding specific individuals whose names appeared repeatedly in seized correspondence. The merchant's responses grew increasingly reluctant, each word extracted with effort that showed in the tension of his chains, the strain of his positioning against cold stone. The interrogator's patience proved as enduring as the tower's walls themselves, each question building upon previous answers to construct a framework of understanding. Cook's commercial empire stretched across the known world, touching ports from Lisbon to Constantinople, creating networks that could serve commerce or conspiracy with equal efficiency. The merchant's knowledge of these connections made him valuable to royal intelligence, whether as willing ally or unwilling source. Brother Benedict's prayers intensified as the crucial moment approached, his voice rising in Latin supplications that seemed to fill the chamber with divine presence. The chaplain understood that souls hung in balance here, that earthly justice sought heavenly guidance in determining the proper course of action. His blessing would sanctify whatever decision emerged from this encounter between royal power and merchant ambition. The chamber's atmosphere grew heavier as afternoon light faded toward evening, shadows deepening around instruments that remained unused but not forgotten. Cook's physical discomfort increased with each passing hour, chains cutting into flesh that had known only silk and comfort. Yet the merchant's spirit remained unbroken, his mind calculating odds and possibilities with the precision that had built his fortune. Master Hartwell's final questions touched upon the most dangerous territory, exploring connections between Cook's commercial network and known Lancastrian sympathizers. The interrogator's voice remained steady, professional, as he guided the conversation toward conclusions that might determine whether the merchant would leave this chamber as free man or condemned traitor. Each word carried weight that could tip scales of justice in directions that would echo through generations. The evening bell of St. Peter's marked the approaching end of daylight, its bronze voice carrying across courtyards where guards prepared for night duty. Within the chamber, torches burned with steady flame, casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper of secrets yet unspoken. The merchant's fate hung in balance, weighted against evidence that remained incomplete, requiring final admissions that might tip justice toward mercy or condemnation. As darkness gathered beyond arrow-slits, the interrogation approached its conclusion, leaving echoes in stone that would endure long after this particular drama had played to its end. Chapter 8. The Interrogator's Art. The morning light filtered through the arrow slits of the White Tower, casting thin bars of pale illumination across the stone floor of the interrogation chamber. Master Thomas de Henley adjusted his leather gloves with deliberate precision, his movements measured and methodical as he prepared for the day's work. The chamber held the accumulated cold of centuries, seeping from the stones that had witnessed countless confessions drawn from trembling lips and breaking spirits. De Henley served as the Tower's chief interrogator under King Edward II, a position that required both scholarly precision and an intimate understanding of human frailty. He had studied at Oxford before circumstances led him to this darker calling, and he approached his duties with the same methodical attention he had once applied to theological texts. The leather-bound ledger before him contained meticulous records of previous sessions, each entry written in his careful script, documenting the progression from denial through resistance to eventual capitulation. The prisoner awaiting his attention was Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, a knight accused of correspondence with Scottish rebels during the ongoing conflicts that plagued the northern borders. De Montfort had been brought to the Tower 3 days prior, his initial defiance still intact despite the damp conditions and meagre rations that served as preliminary persuasions. The knight's noble bearing remained evident even in his current circumstances, his shoulders straight despite the weight of iron shackles that bound his wrists. The chamber itself had been designed for its purpose with careful consideration of both practical and psychological effects. The ceiling vaulted overhead, creating an echo that magnified every sound and made whispers carry with unnatural clarity. Braziers burned along the walls, their flames casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe across the stone surfaces like living things. The warmth they provided was carefully controlled, never quite sufficient to dispel the bone-deep chill that served as a constant reminder of vulnerability. Along the eastern wall stood the implements of interrogation, each piece crafted by skilled metal workers who understood their terrible purpose. The rack dominated the centre of the collection, its wooden frame worn smooth by countless hands and bodies. Iron rings set into the walls at varying heights could accommodate different positions and pressures. Smaller devices lay arranged on a wooden table like surgical instruments, their purposes known only to those who wielded them and those who had felt their touch. De Henley began each session with the same ritual. He would light the candles that stood in iron holders around the chamber, the wax tapers adding their wavering light to the brazier flames. The act of illumination served multiple purposes, both practical and ceremonial. The flickering light created an atmosphere of uncertainty, making shadows dance and shift unpredictably. More importantly, it allowed the prisoner to see clearly what awaited them, understanding coming not through description, but through direct observation. The interrogator opened his ledger to a fresh page, dipping his quill in the inkwell with the practiced motion of a scholar. The parchment bore the royal seal at its head, marking this as official business of the crown. Every word spoken, every sound uttered, would be recorded for review by higher authorities. This documentation served as both protection for the interrogator and warning for the prisoner that nothing would be forgotten or overlooked. Sir Geoffrey watched these preparations with the stoic expression of a man accustomed to facing death in battle. The knight's training had prepared him for physical hardship and the possibility of capture, but the deliberate scholarly approach of his captor presented challenges different from those encountered on any battlefield. There was no honour to be won here, no glory to be claimed through courage or skill at arms. The morning progressed with methodical questioning. De Henley's voice remained calm and conversational, his tone suggesting nothing more threatening than academic discussion. He inquired about the knight's movements during recent months, his contacts with other nobles, his knowledge of activities along the Scottish border. The questions came in careful sequence, each designed to build upon previous answers and reveal inconsistencies or omissions. Hours passed in this manner, the interrogator displaying infinite patience while the prisoner maintained his denials. The candles burned lower in their holders, wax pooling on the iron surfaces and occasionally dripping to the stone floor with soft impacts that seemed unnaturally loud in the chamber's acoustics. Outside, the sounds of tower life continued, guards calling to one another, the clatter of cartwheels on cobblestones, the distant cry of merchants hawking their wares in the city beyond. As the afternoon light began to fade from the arrow slits, de Henley made note of the prisoner's physical condition. Fatigue showed in the slight tremor that had developed in the knight's hands, the way his shoulders had begun to slump despite his efforts to maintain military bearing. Hunger and thirst worked their own subtle pressures, weakening resolve through the body's basic needs. The interrogator rose from his chair and walked slowly around the chamber, his footsteps echoing off the stones. He paused beside various instruments, not touching them but allowing his gaze to linger with professional assessment. The psychological pressure of proximity often proved more effective than actual application, imagination frequently exceeding reality in its capacity to inspire fear. The crown requires truth from its subjects, de Henley observed, his voice carrying clearly in the stone-walled space. Loyalty demands honesty, particularly in matters touching upon the realm's security. He returned to his chair and took up his quill once more, ready to resume the patient questioning that formed the foundation of his craft. Sir Geoffrey's resistance began showing subtle cracks as evening approached. Small hesitations appeared in his responses, brief moments where certainty wavered before reasserting itself. The interrogator noted these fluctuations carefully, marking them in his ledger for future reference. Experience had taught him that resistance rarely crumbled all at once, but rather eroded gradually like stone worn smooth by persistent water. The prisoner's noble birth provided both protection and vulnerability. His rank ensured certain courtesies would be observed, preventing the most extreme measures from being applied without explicit royal authorization. However, his education and refined sensibilities made him more susceptible to psychological pressures that might prove ineffective against rougher subjects. The prospect of physical degradation carried particular horror for those accustomed to honour and dignity. As darkness gathered outside the tower walls, brazier flames became the primary source of illumination in the chamber. The wavering light transformed the space into something primal and threatening, casting long shadows that seemed to reach across the stones like grasping fingers. The temperature dropped with the disappearance of sunlight, making the insufficient warmth from the fires more noticeable and uncomfortable. De Henley lit fresh candles to replace those that had burned low, the ritual marking another phase in the interrogation process. Night sessions carried particular psychological weight, isolating prisoners from the normal rhythms of life and creating a sense of endless duration. Time itself became a weapon in the interrogator's arsenal, stretching moments into eternities of uncertainty and fear. The questioning resumed with renewed intensity, though the interrogator's manner remained unchanged. His calm persistence wore away at the prisoner's defences like water against stone, each repeated inquiry adding weight to the accumulation of pressure. Sir Geoffrey's responses grew shorter, more guarded, as if conserving strength for battles yet to come. Hours passed in this fashion, the rhythm of question and answer punctuated by the scratch of quill on parchment and the occasional hiss of candle wax meeting flame. The prisoner's endurance showed signs of strain, though his basic denials remained intact. The interrogator noted these observations methodically, building a detailed record that would guide future sessions and inform decisions about escalating measures. Near midnight, de Henley called for a brief recess, allowing guards to provide the prisoner with water and a small portion of bread. These mercies served calculated purposes, demonstrating that cooperation could bring relief, while highlighting the interrogator's control over even basic comforts. The knight accepted the sustenance gratefully, his noble pride insufficient to overcome biological necessity. The final hours before dawn brought a different quality to the proceedings. Exhaustion weighed heavily on both men, though the interrogator's experience better prepared him for extended sessions. The prisoner's resolve showed deeper cracks, moments of confusion appearing in his responses as fatigue clouded his judgment. These lapses provided valuable opportunities for probing questions that might reveal information previously concealed. As the first pale light of morning began filtering through the arrow slits, Sir Geoffrey's resistance finally showed signs of fundamental weakness. The careful denials that had sustained him through the night began fragmenting under the accumulated pressure of hours without rest, proper food, or comfort. His shoulders sagged with defeat even as his lips continued forming words of defiance. De Henley recognised the approaching moment with professional satisfaction. Experience had taught him to read the signs that preceded confession, the particular quality of exhaustion that opened minds to persuasion, the way resistance collapsed not in dramatic fashion, but through gradual erosion of will. The knight's spirit remained unbroken, but his practical defences had been worn thin by the patient application of pressure. The interrogator prepared fresh parchment and sharpened his quill with deliberate care. The confession, when it came, would need to be recorded with perfect accuracy, every word preserved for examination by royal officials. The Tower's reputation for extracting truth rested upon such meticulous documentation, proof that its methods achieved results that justified their employment. Dawnlight strengthened in the arrow slits as the chamber prepared to witness another surrender to the Crown's inexorable demand for loyalty and truth. The instruments along the wall remained untouched, their mere presence having accomplished what actual application might have achieved through cruder means. In the Tower's ancient stones, another chapter in the long history of power and submission approached its inevitable conclusion, while London stirred to life beyond the walls where such necessities of rule unfolded in shadow and silence. Chapter 9. The Scribe's Burden. The quill trembled in Master Geoffrey's weathered fingers as he dipped it once more into the iron-bound inkwell. The chamber beneath the White Tower held secrets that would never see daylight, yet someone must record them. Someone must bear witness to what transpired in these stone depths, where justice wore the mask of necessity, and truth emerged only through pain. The February cold had settled into his bones during the long hours of waiting. Candles burned low in their iron holders, casting wavering shadows across the vaulted ceiling, where moisture gathered like tears of ancient kings. The Thames beyond these walls ran black under winter stars, carrying away the whispered prayers and final words of those who had descended these steps before. Master Geoffrey had served as official scribe to the Tower for 7 years, his careful script recording confessions, last testaments, and the methodical application of interrogation techniques that had evolved over centuries of royal justice. His hand remained steady despite what he had witnessed, for duty demanded precision above all else. The Crown required documentation, and he provided it with the same meticulous care he had once brought to illuminating sacred texts in the monastery of his youth. The prisoner had been brought down 3 hours past midnight. Sir Edmund Blackthorne, once a trusted courtier who had whispered in the King's ear at Westminster, now hung in chains that had held nobles and commoners alike. The transformation from silk-clad advisor to broken man in iron restraints spoke to the swift justice of Tudor England, where favour could turn to suspicion with the changing of a season. The charges were treason, that most fluid of medieval crimes that could encompass everything from speaking against royal policy to harbouring forbidden thoughts about the succession. Sir Edmund had been accused of corresponding with agents of France, of passing intelligence about English defences along the Scottish border, of plotting to deliver strategic ports into enemy hands. Whether these accusations held truth mattered less than the Crown's need for certainty in uncertain times. Master Thomas Wexford, the Tower's chief interrogator, moved through his preparations with the calm efficiency of long practice. His tools lay arranged on the wooden table like implements for some dark sacrament. Iron screws that could compress bone to powder, leather straps that would hold a man motionless while truth was extracted drop by drop, heated irons that could brand flesh with the King's justice. Each instrument had been blessed by royal chaplains and sanctified by centuries of use in service to the crown. The confession chair stood in the centre of the chamber like a throne carved from nightmares. Iron plates could be heated beneath its seat until the metal glowed dull red in the torchlight. Straps would hold a prisoner motionless while the heat rose through layers of cloth and flesh, encouraging honesty through methodical application of pain. Kings had authorized its use, bishops had blessed its purpose, and learned men had written treatises on the theological necessity of such devices in pursuit of truth. Sir Edmund had maintained his innocence through the preliminary questioning in the upper chambers. He had sworn by Christ's wounds and the Virgin's mercy that no treasonous correspondence had passed through his hands. He had called upon his years of faithful service, his donations to the church, his unquestioned loyalty to the crown. Such protestations meant little in the tower's depths, where loyalty was measured not by past service, but by present cooperation. The fire had been lit hours earlier, its flames licking at the iron brazier until the coals glowed like captured stars. Master Wexford selected his first implement with the care of a surgeon choosing his blade, testing its weight and balance before approaching the prisoner. The art of interrogation required patience above all else, a gradual escalation that allowed the subject to understand fully what awaited those who chose stubborn silence over truthful confession. Master Geoffrey's quill scratched across the parchment as he recorded each detail. The time of commencement, the prisoner's initial responses, the specific methods employed, and their duration. Such documentation served multiple purposes: evidence for royal review, justification for the Crown's actions, and instruction for future interrogators who might face similar cases. The written word would outlive all present in this chamber, carrying their actions into history's judgment. The prisoner's breathing had grown laboured as the iron implements drew closer. Fear possessed its own eloquence, loosening tongues that had remained sealed through reasoned argument and gentle persuasion. Master Wexford understood this fundamental truth of human nature, how the body's wisdom often overruled the mind's stubborn loyalty. Pain stripped away pretense and revealed the raw honesty that lay beneath layers of courtly training and noble breeding. Sir Edmund began to speak as the heated iron approached his skin, words tumbling over each other in desperate haste. He named contacts in French ports, described meetings in London taverns where coded messages changed hands, revealed the location of documents hidden within his manor's walls. Each revelation earned him a moment's reprieve. Each confession brought him distance from the glowing iron that waited with infinite patience. Master Geoffrey recorded it all, his trained ear catching names and details that would require investigation. Some accusations would prove true, others false, still others impossible to verify. The truth mattered less than the appearance of thoroughness, the Crown's demonstration that no stone would remain unturned in pursuit of those who threatened England's security. Each name mentioned would face its own questioning, creating an ever-widening web of investigation and suspicion. The candles burned lower as hours passed in the windowless chamber. Time moved differently in the tower's depths, marked not by church bells or changing light, but by the rhythm of question and answer, confession and verification. Master Wexford possessed infinite patience, allowing lengthy pauses between applications of his craft while the prisoner's imagination conjured horrors worse than any reality. By dawn's approach, Sir Edmund had provided enough information to satisfy the Crown's requirements. His confession filled 3 sheets of parchment in Master Geoffrey's careful script, each page bearing the official seal that would authenticate its contents for royal review. The prisoner hung exhausted in his chains, his earlier defiance replaced by the hollow compliance of a man who had traded secrets for survival. The interrogation's conclusion brought no relief to the stone chamber. Sir Edmund's confession would require verification, his associates would face their own questioning, and the documents he'd revealed would need recovery and analysis. Justice in the Tudor realm moved with methodical thoroughness, each thread of suspicion followed to its source regardless of where it might lead. Master Geoffrey gathered his materials with practiced efficiency. The inkwell must be sealed, the parchments carefully rolled and bound, the confession prepared for delivery to the Crown's officials who would decide the prisoner's ultimate fate. His own role was complete, but the machinery of royal justice had only begun its work. The guards would escort Sir Edmund back to his cell in the upper levels, where he would await word of the king's pleasure. Some prisoners received pardons after providing satisfactory cooperation. Others faced the headsman's block regardless of their assistance, and still others simply disappeared into the tower's depths never to emerge. The Crown's mercy remained as unpredictable as its wrath, following patterns known only to God and the king. Master Wexford extinguished the brazier's coals with practiced care, his instruments cooling in the February air that seeped through ancient stones. The chamber would rest until the next prisoner required its services, its iron implements waiting with the patience of centuries for fresh opportunities to serve the Crown's justice. Such was the rhythm of the tower's existence, eternal cycles of suspicion and confession, punctuated by brief moments of silence. The dawn light beginning to filter through the tower's upper windows brought no warmth to the stone depths where truth had been extracted through pain and patience. Master Geoffrey climbed the worn steps toward daylight, his burden of knowledge heavier than the parchments he carried. Behind him, the chamber settled back into darkness, waiting for the next chapter in England's long history of necessary cruelties. The Thames continued its ancient flow beyond the tower's walls, carrying away the night's secrets while London stirred to life above. In time, Sir Edmund's confession would fade into historical archives, another document in the endless accumulation of human betrayal and survival that mark the medieval world's approach to justice and truth. Chapter 10. The Keeper's Vigil. The candle had burned to half its length when Brother Matthew finished writing the final confession. His quill trembled slightly as he set it aside, the parchment still gleaming wet with ink that would soon dry to the colour of dried blood. Outside the chamber window, dawn crept across the Thames like a pale benediction, touching the stone walls of the tower with fingers of gold and grey. The prisoner had spoken his last words an hour before sunrise. They were not words of defiance or despair, but of a man who had finally found peace in the telling of truth. His voice had grown steady as the night progressed, each revelation lifting a burden that had pressed upon his soul like the very stones of these walls. The scribes had recorded every syllable, every pause, every breath that carried the weight of secrets too long held. In the corner of the chamber, Master Aldrich cleaned his instruments with the methodical care of a craftsman. The brazier had grown cold, its coals fading to grey ash that would be swept away when the morning watch arrived. He had not needed to employ the harsher tools of his trade. The promise of their presence had been sufficient to loosen the tongue that diplomacy and gold had failed to move. The tower had seen such nights beyond counting. Within these walls, the machinery of royal justice had turned with relentless precision for 3 centuries, grinding through the fates of kings and peasants, nobles and merchants, priests and soldiers. Each stone had absorbed the whispers of conspiracy, the gasps of pain, the final prayers of those who would never see another sunrise. The very mortar between the blocks seemed mixed with the dust of forgotten bones and the salt of tears that had dried centuries ago. Brother Matthew gathered the scattered parchments, arranging them in careful order. These pages would join countless others in the royal archives, their contents to be studied by clerks and councillors who would determine which threads of treason needed cutting and which conspiracies required deeper investigation. The confessions extracted in this chamber had toppled dynasties and elevated commoners to heights of power they could never have imagined. Truth, when properly harvested, proved more valuable than gold from the royal mines. The prisoner had been a merchant named Edmund Hartwell, whose ships had carried more than wool and spices across the Channel. For months he had ferried letters between disgruntled nobles and foreign courts, each message a thread in a web of conspiracy that stretched from London to Paris to Rome. His warehouses had concealed not only contraband goods, but men whose loyalty lay with claimants to the throne, who slept in exile beyond English shores. The interrogation had begun at midnight, as custom dictated. Master Aldrich had started with gentle inquiries, his voice carrying the tone of a confessor rather than an inquisitor. He spoke of families and fortunes, of the mercy that awaited those who chose honesty over obstinacy. The merchant had resisted at first, claiming innocence with the fervour of a man who had rehearsed his denials in the darkness of his cell. But the tower possessed a way of wearing down such protestations. The sight of the instruments carefully arranged and gleaming in the torchlight had begun the work. The brazier, glowing red as the fires of hell, had continued it. And when Master Aldrich had begun to speak of specific dates and names, of ships that had sailed under cover of darkness and meetings held in the shadowed corners of taverns, the merchant's resolve had cracked like ice beneath a spring sun. The confessions had flowed then like water through a broken dam. Names tumbled forth in a torrent that kept Brother Matthew's quill dancing across the parchment for hours. Lords and ladies whose ancestors had fought at Hastings, merchants whose gold financed rebellion, priests whose sermons carried coded messages to the faithful. The web of conspiracy had proven vast indeed, reaching into the very heart of the royal court itself. Master Aldrich had listened to each revelation with the patience of a hunter, waiting for prey to emerge from cover. His questions had been precise, surgical in their intent, designed to extract not merely names but the full structure of the treasonous network. When had certain meetings occurred? Who had carried which messages? Where had gold changed hands to purchase loyalty that should have belonged to the crown alone? The merchant had answered with growing eagerness, as if each confession lifted a stone from his chest. Perhaps he had carried these secrets too long, their weight growing heavier with each passing day. Perhaps the certainty of death had freed him from the bonds of loyalty that had held his tongue. Or perhaps the sight of instruments that promised pain beyond imagining had simply proven more persuasive than honour or friendship. As the night had worn on, other figures had entered and departed the chamber. Clerks had carried messages to the royal apartments, where councillors waited to hear which heads would roll and which estates would be forfeit to the crown. Guards had escorted witnesses who could corroborate particular details, their own fates hanging upon the accuracy of their testimony. The machinery of justice had awakened throughout the tower, grinding to life like some great engine fed by confession and blood. Brother Matthew remembered similar nights from years past, when other conspiracies had unravelled in these same chambers. He had recorded the confessions of knights who had plotted against King Edward, of merchants who had traded with Scotland during times of war, of priests who had carried papal bulls declaring English monarchs excommunicate. Each case had followed familiar patterns, the accused moving through denial and defiance to bargaining, and finally to complete surrender. The tower itself seemed to encourage such surrenders. Its walls had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, had sheltered kings who ruled wisely and tyrants who died violently. Within its compass, the wheel of fortune spun with particular cruelty, elevating men to power only to cast them down with devastating swiftness. Those who entered as prisoners learned quickly that their former lives meant nothing within these walls. Here, only truth mattered, truth extracted by whatever means proved necessary. Master Aldrich finished cleaning his tools and began returning them to their appointed places. The rack stood silent in its corner, its ropes and pulleys waiting for the next session. The brazier cooled steadily, its iron implements growing cold as winter stones. The scribe's chair, where broken men had whispered their secrets, would remain empty until darkness fell again, and new prisoners descended the spiral stairs. The merchant would face the executioner at noon, his fate sealed by the very words he had spoken to purchase a few hours of mercy. The crowds would gather in the courtyard to witness justice, their upturned faces hungry for the spectacle of a traitor's death. children would point and laugh as the condemned man mounted the scaffold, not understanding that they watched the turning of fortune's wheel that might someday claim their own fathers and brothers. Such was the way of the Tower, the way it had always been since William the Conqueror had laid the first stones of the White Tower upon the ancient Roman foundations. Kings and commoners, nobles and merchants, all found equal treatment within these walls when accused of treason. The instruments of confession cared nothing for bloodline or birthright. The headsman's axe fell with equal weight upon necks both common and noble. Brother Matthew rolled the completed confessions in oiled cloth, sealing them with wax that bore the royal arms. These documents would outlive the merchant whose words they preserved, would remain in the archives long after his name was forgotten by all, save the clerks who maintained the records of royal justice. History would remember the conspiracy he had revealed, but the man himself would fade into the vast company of those who had paid the ultimate price for their involvement in affairs of state. The dawnlight grew stronger, painting the chamber walls with hues of rose and gold. Soon the day watch would arrive to escort the prisoner to his final meal, to allow him the ministrations of a priest before his appointment with the executioner. The wheels of justice, once set in motion, ground forward with inexorable purpose until they reached their predetermined destination. Master Aldrich extinguished the remaining torches, leaving only the pale morning light to illuminate the chamber. The instruments of his trade disappeared into shadow, waiting with patient hunger for the next night's work. The Tower kept its own schedule, its rhythms governed not by the sun and moon, but by the deeper currents of conspiracy and betrayal that flowed through the realm like underground rivers. Outside, London awakened to another day of commerce and conversation, of markets and marriages, of all the ordinary business of life that continued regardless of who lived or died within the Tower's walls. The Thames flowed past as it had for countless centuries, carrying away the ashes of burned confessions and the secrets that would never be recorded on any parchment. Brother Matthew closed his writing case and gathered his robes about him. His work was finished, but the Tower's vigil continued. Tomorrow night, perhaps, other prisoners would occupy this chamber. Other secrets would spill like wine upon these stones. The great wheel would turn again, grinding new grain in the mill of royal justice. He paused at the chamber door, looking back at the scene of the night's revelations. The chair where the merchant had sat bore the impression of his body. The stone floor showed dark stains that might have been tears or blood. By evening, servants would clean and prepare the chamber for its next occupant, erasing all trace of what had transpired here. But the Tower itself would remember, as it remembered all the nights of confession and revelation that had preceded this one. Its stones held the echoes of 10,000 secrets. Its walls bore witness to centuries of truth extracted by fear and pain. In the royal archives, the accumulated confessions of generations moulded in their oiled wrappings, testimony to the relentless work of maintaining the realm's security. The merchant's name would join that vast catalogue of the condemned, his fate a warning to others who might contemplate treason. The conspiracy he had revealed would be uprooted systematically, each conspirator tracked down and brought to account. The gold that had financed rebellion would flow back into the royal treasury. The ships that had carried treasonous correspondence would sail under new masters, loyal to the crown. This was the Tower's gift to the realm, the dark service it performed in chambers hidden from common sight. While London slept peacefully beyond its walls, the work of preservation continued, ensuring that threats to the royal peace were discovered and eliminated before they could bear their poisonous fruit. Brother Matthew descended the spiral stairs, his footsteps echoing in the stone well. Above him, the chamber fell into silence, waiting with the patience of centuries for night to return. The candle had burned to nothing, leaving only a pool of hardened wax to mark where light had held back the darkness. The wheel of justice paused in its turning, but only briefly, gathering strength for the next revolution. The Tower stood eternal, sentinel and executioner, confessor and judge. Within its walls, The machinery of power ground forward through the centuries, indifferent to the fates of individual men but devoted utterly to the preservation of the realm. Its stones would outlast kingdoms, its purposes would endure long after the names of kings were forgotten. The candle burned low, the chamber fell silent, and history once again turned the page in the dark.